Welcome to another event of the Amherst Irish Association. We're so glad to have you all join us. This is the final event of this series, a series that began in 2014 when we formed our association in the wake of drunken riots here in Amherst that unfortunately got associated with something called the Blarney Blowout. And we decided to do something positive about that. And so we formed the Amherst Irish Association, which has led to a wonderful series of events, great speakers, all of whom are volunteers. We're a small group, all volunteer group. And we're just so grateful to everyone who's supported us over the years. And we hope that you enjoy today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ida O'Carroll.
Good, Sam. Thank you, Sam. Agus fáilte isteach. Welcome, everybody. There's an Irish saying or a proverb that goes, "Is scá a chéile a bhara na daoine," or put into direct translation, it's we survive in the shadow of one another or in the shelter of one another. We've kind of rephrased it a bit on our website to say we thrive in our togetherness. And don't we know a bit about that lately with the pandemic? And the Amherst Irish Association has been about a community response. All of our 6 directors, and I'd like to name them, Sam, Tim, Annie, Jonathan and Amanda and myself, are all volunteers. All our members support us through their contributions. And I would remind you, $25 would be very nicely put to good use. And the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland, through the Boston Consulate, support our advertising every year. So we have this sense of scá chéile a bhara na daoine. Our presenters are all from the community. They don't get paid either. We give them a lovely cup of tea and a scone when we meet in person, and we value their contribution. So we've managed to make it this far. And if you're a member, you'll get a copy of our calendar for this year, which also has a copy of all the programs to date. It'll give you a sense of the range of topics, history, culture, language, and so forth that we've managed to cover. And all of it community-based, all of it pro bono, and is scá chéile a bhara na daoine. It is my great delight to kind of add to Sam's words about the last event in our current program, if I can say it that way. We've already decided on our next program, and we're going to start with a hoolie. And what a time for a hoolie, and we need one in September. We're going to have our resident musicians organized always with the support of Jonathan and Amanda. They're a group called Le Chéile, which means together, again emphasizing our overall motto. And we're going to have that hopefully in person in our usual venue. So keep an eye on that, and we advertise in the local papers, and you can always check our website, amherstirish.org. Okay, please become a member if you would. It's our one kind of source of funds to enable us to book our venue, to enable us to provide delicious tea and scones after each presentation when we meet. And after all of that hard sell, it comes to me with great pleasure, introduce my good friend and one of our stalwart members in our Amherst Irish Association, Tim Goodhind. He's not only our association's treasurer, he takes care of the website, and he's, as they say, the Scottish, I think of the toast, the Scottish toast, here's to them and them like us, damn few. Here's to a really good man. I give you Timothy Goodhind. Away lad, Tim.
Thank you very much, Ida. That was very, very nice. I really appreciate that. So welcome, everybody. Today, I'm going to speak to you as an amateur genealogist about DNA testing and Irish ancestry. For that, I'm going to share my screen here a second, so please bear with me. And you can all see that, I hope. So today I'm going to talk specifically about the 5 major companies that do DNA testing. That's 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA. I'm going to mention this to you at the start is I don't have an awful lot of information about MyHeritage. It's the only one of the 5 that I haven't tested with. However, I'm going to show you what the other 4 look like and talk to you a little bit about MyHeritage. I want to remind everybody, please, if you would, make sure that your microphone is muted as I go through this so that we don't pick up any extraneous sound as I'm ticking off this. Because this is in fact being recorded and it's going to end up on YouTube. So this is a huge subject. This is only meant to be a start, an introduction, and it's not meant to be the be all and the end all of what DNA testing is about. What I hope to go over today is why it's important to consider DNA testing for genealogy. This is a new and upcoming thing. It's very, very exciting, but it's got a lot of moving parts. I'm going to talk briefly about basic science and terminology. I apologize for that. There's a certain number of things that you need to know in order to understand how this works. So I'm going to go over some of the very basics. I'm going to compare the features of the 5 the largest DNA companies, as I mentioned. This is only going to be about 45 minutes long, so it's going to be fast. It's going to be extremely fast. As usual, we're going to hold the questions to the end, and I'll talk more about that here right at the end. The last thing I'm going to talk about is caveats about doing DNA testing, because in some situations, you might reconsider. I mean, I would encourage you to do it, but there might be situations where you might not want to do it. And I'll talk about that. So why do DNA testing? What does it give to the genealogist? Some pros. DNA testing can absolutely prove relationships where standard genealogy may only be able to guess. So you think you've worked your family tree out, you think it all makes sense, but then suddenly it doesn't make sense anymore. DNA can prove that relationship for you. It can also help you jump brick walls in your family tree. And this is especially important because in Ireland, there are years of missing records and very common surnames. If you're researching Murphy, for instance, that's like researching Smith over here. It's ubiquitous across the entire of Ireland, and you'll have a heck of a time trying to do it without some kind of idea of where your family might have come from. This can help you jump that. Whoops, I meant to stick back. DNA testing can introduce you to living relatives who can bridge record gaps. This is really, really exciting stuff in Ireland. Imagine coming across a second cousin that you never knew about, who's alive today in some little village in Ireland, where you never knew that your family had any basis to be. That's a match, and that's somebody that you're going to want to contact. More pros, ethnicity estimates. This is where you find out just how Irish you are, and perhaps some geographic points of origin, because as I said, you can point out specific locations. And the other thing is you only have to share what you want to share. If you do not want to tell anybody anything other than to do the test, you can actually keep it private like that. So why not do it? Well, it doesn't replace genealogy research. You still have to do the chart. Sorry, it's the way it is. You've got to run the numbers out. You've got to put people's names in if you want to do the genealogy itself. There can be unexpected results. These are called NPEs, non-parental events. I'm going to talk more about those at the end, but they can be very damaging to a family. It can get expensive. You can do your first DNA test, and I'll tell you right now, if you're a genealogist, you're not going to stop there. You're going to want to do another one because you're going to want to find out if the first one was accurate. So you're going to do another one. And then you may be like me and you're going to do another one. So it can get expensive. Unfortunately, it can also suggest for some reason that ethnic differences between races are somehow more important than they are, and that they're somehow fixed. And as I've been reading more about this, this is considered kind of a subtle form of racism to say I'm more Irish this and less of that, or I have more of that than this. Something to consider. The last one is there can be issues of privacy if you don't grab the bull by the horns and make sure that you are protected. The companies themselves will protect your data for you, but if you give it out for any reason, they can't control something like that. So what is DNA? Here's the science part. Grit your teeth, grab the table, bear through with this. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So what is it? They contain nucleotides, which are organic molecules. These things carry our biological information and our heredity. They tell our cells when and how to replicate. If you look at this picture over on the right, you see the pink circle, that's supposed to be a cell. Inside is a purple nucleus. And inside that are those X's, which are supposed to be chromosomes. If you took the chromosomes apart, they're wound very, very tightly. You get these strings like we see here. And this is what we think about as this double helix of DNA. Now, as I mentioned, the X there, that's called a chromosome. And these are highly organized thread-like structures of protein and a single molecule of DNA and contained within the nucleus. We virtually all have 23 pair of chromosomes called a set for a total of 46. 22 pair of what are called autosomes and 1 pair of called sex chromosomes, allosomes. It is possible to have more than 23 pair. I can't get into that. We really would need a microbiologist to talk about that, but it is possible. Virtually all of us have 23. 1 set of those came from mom and 1 set comes from dad. Genes are the basic unit of heredity. Within each chromosome, there can be hundreds of thousands of genes. These are nucleotide segments of DNA which contain codes for specific proteins. In the bottom right of the screen are the 4 proteins that they're talking about. And I don't want to spend a lot of time about them. The graphic in the middle, by the way, I chose it because it's got that DNA structure, that double helix, but the flags in there show that our DNA goes across all borders. And the point of this is to say most genes that we carry are exactly the same from person to person. In fact, 99.9% of all of our genes are the same. It doesn't matter where we were born. It doesn't matter what country. It doesn't matter what race. Less than 0.1% of all genes account for all the differences we see in each other. That's weight and height and race and the way you comb your hair. Or I shouldn't say the way you comb it, the way it lays out. DNA testing looks at less than 1% of that 0.1%. So we're talking about much, much smaller numbers. How much DNA do you share with your ancestors? This is the first of a couple of charts. And what you see here is in the first column is generations, and that starts self, parents, and so on. Number of individuals in that generation in the next column. The third one is a single ancestor's DNA contribution, the true DNA range, and a hypothetical birth year. So if we start at the top with self, we've got 1 individual contributing 100% DNA, and that's accurate. And the birth year about, we'll say 1950, just for the sake of an example. Parents, self has 2 parents, 50% of DNA is handed down from mom and from dad. And that's pretty much a hard 50%. However, when you get to grandparents, oh, I'm sorry, I need to skip ahead here. When you get to that first column again, you get to fourth set of great grandparents, which is 6 generations out. We're talking about 64 individuals that you share DNA with. When you get out to the 9th generation, we're talking about 2,048. And for those of you who have worked genealogy before, you know that when we get out 9 generations, we're pretty much at the outside of what we can do. We can probably take certain lines farther, but you're talking about 2,000 people. That's difficult. So when we look at single ancestors' contribution, by the math, every time there's a generation, you get half of the half of the half. So you go grandparents, 25%, great-grandparents, 12.5, and on down. But the truth is, you don't get that hard number. The truth is, by the time you get to grandparents, you could be talking 20 to 30% from a grandparent of their DNA. And the truth is, it's more like, could be 17 to 32. The point is there's a range. And when you get down to great-grandparents, you're talking about 7% to 17%. When you get down to 3rd set of great-grandparents, you're already down to 0.5% shared. The last thing I want to point out on this slide before I leave it is at the 9th set of great-grandparents, we're talking about 0.5% being passed down. So we're starting to see really infinitesimally small numbers. It's still there, but it's really small. So let me talk briefly about the 3 different kinds of testing that we do, or they do. The first one is called autosomal. It's the 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes that I talked about. 50% from mom, 50% from dad. For every child, however, that 50% is different. So we've got a son and a daughter here. The DNA that they receive from mom and dad is 50% each, but every time they have a child, that 50% is a different 50%, except in the case of identical siblings, who are always the same sex. And I'm going to talk more about them in a minute, but identical siblings get exactly the same DNA. Remember, before I move on, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on do not get a hard 25%. So what does this look like? This is a pedigree chart, which those of you who do genealogy recognize. And you see you on the far left, and then each generation out, it breaks out until you get, in this particular chart, 16 sets or 16 individual grandparents. Autosomal DNA testing covers all of them, covers everybody that's in this chart and beyond. So it's really important to understand autosomal casts a very wide net when you're trying to catch fish. And that's what we look for in genealogy. Second type of DNA testing is of the sex chromosome, the Y chromosome. This is a picture on the right, supposedly, of a photograph of what an X and Y chromosome look like, infinitesimally small, these chromosomes. A female receives an X chromosome from mom and an X chromosome from dad. And a female is designated for that reason, XX. A male receives an X chromosome from mom and a Y from dad, and is designated XY. So why is this important? It is not possible, using the sex chromosome only, to trace a female's father's line because she never received a Y chromosome. Conversely, a male cannot trace his mother's father's line because she never received the Y chromosome. So does that mean you can't test? No, you can. You can test something else, and usually it's autosomal. But for these reasons, Y DNA testing is not usually the first choice for DNA testing. What does this look like? Here's our pedigree chart. If you notice on the side, it says U, meaning male. I'll get back to that in a second. But it's passed down from the father, from the grandfather, the great-grandfather. It only follows the male line. And this is only that sex chromosome. The next kind that's out there, the third kind that's most often used for genealogical DNA testing, is mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. If you look at the picture here, you see the blue in the middle. That's the nucleus of the cell, which kind of looks like a potato. And inside that is the mitochondria, the mitochondrial DNA. And they don't look like any other kind of DNA. They're circular. And they have a completely different kind of DNA. They have their own structure. This DNA is actually handed down by the mother to both male and female children, both. And it only follows the female line going backwards. So what does that look like? We go back to our pedigree chart, and it says you as either a male or a female. You can look at mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, so on and so forth, but it only follows that line. Everything else on the chart is grayed out. It's the only thing that you can see. So to review, these are the 3 kinds. ATDNA, autosomal DNA, test DNA with 22 pairs of autosomes, most effective going back only about 6 generations or so. Y-DNA is males only, passed from father to son. Interestingly, it very rarely mutates. And therefore, Y chromosomes, you can look back 1,000 years or more, which is pretty amazing. It's often used right now for doing what they call as surname searches. So for instance, if you were a Gilligan and you wanted to trace Gilligans all the way back, O'Brien's, there's a way to be able to do this. excuse me, do that using the Y DNA. The last one, mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to all children, male or female, but only follows the female line, also rarely mutates, and you can look back 1,000 years or more. For genealogical purposes, autosomal DNA is the one that's most popular, and that's the one that most companies are using. That's the one that they appeal to with in all the commercials. So one of the questions that comes up is, since a female can't test for the Y chromosome, does that mean she can't test at all for her father's Y DNA? No, that's not true. There are other people that you could test besides a female. For instance, a full brother or a half brother who shares the same father, paternal uncle, a male paternal cousin. You could even test your grandfather's brother's son, for instance, because all of those would have the same result as far as Y DNA is concerned. They all track the same thing, and those are unbroken lines. So let me talk briefly about the 5 major companies. It's important to understand that all DNA companies are testing your DNA against their databases, and their databases are limited. This is not looking at all of Ireland. They're looking at the people that have tested and say that they're from Ireland, or their DNA shows, because they've got such a large group to look at now. Ethnicity results are estimates, and they change. Believe me, they change. I tested 5 or 6 years ago now with Ancestry.com, and since then, my DNA results have changed 4 times. And that's not only because of the science, and it is, but it's also because their database got bigger. And as it gets bigger, they're able to look at more and more of it and say, oh, I recognize this DNA. I know where it's from. When I was getting ready to write all this up for this presentation, I came across a genealogist who said that you should consider DNA testing this way as recreational testing. In other words, don't take it too serious. And that, I believe that. I agree with that. It's recreational testing. Don't get hard and fast on it. One of the things is, for instance, if it says that you've got 75% Irish DNA, don't run out and buy the t-shirt emblazoned with, I'm 75% Irish on it. That's Irish at the time the test was made with the database that they had. It could change, and it does change. So first company, Ancestry.com, largest database across the world. I'm going to talk about that more in just a second here. Second one, 23andMe, best for heredity health questions by far. Also an extremely large database, so you're looking at a great cross-section of stuff. LivingDNA.com, best for UK genealogy. However, not for Irish genealogy, interestingly enough. You would think it would be, but it's not. Personally, I think it might be because the Irish don't want to buy something from a British company. I can't swear that that's true, and it may not be true, but it's my impression. Family Tree DNA, best science and Y DNA testing out there by far. And last is MyHeritage.com. This is the one that I have not tested with. I understand that it's best for Jewish ancestry, and they are in fact centered in Israel. So they do a broad-based thing, but their database is smaller, like some of the other companies, which I'll talk about here in a second. So this is another chart I'm going to take you through quickly and tell you that as we look at this line by line, for size, that is, how big a database do these companies have? And you see for Ancestry right now, they're saying they have about 26 million people who have tested with them. 23andMe is about 23 million. Living DNA isn't producing their numbers, but obviously they're going to be a lot smaller than that. And more likely what they're going to be is closer to what Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage have, which is about 2 million. That's probably where their database is at. Shared matches means if you match with someone on there, if you find someone that says, this guy's probably a relative, can you see how you're related? In other words, does it suggest to you this is a first cousin, a second cousin, or something else? Yes, you can in all of them, but in Living DNA and Family Tree, it's kind of limited. I wouldn't count on them 100% as to what they're doing. It's kind of vague. Family Tree, can you upload your family tree as a genealogist? Why is this important? Because if there's somebody out there that you match to and they've uploaded their family trees, you can actually see how you match and where that spot is, where you share a common ancestor. Saves a lot of time. Will they accept data transfers? This is kind of an interesting thing. Suppose I tested with Ancestry.com and got my results, and I have what's called raw data. My raw data never changes. I own it. It's my DNA. I can actually, you know, for want of a better expression, give it away. So what if I wanted to go to Family Tree DNA and give them my raw data without having to take a new sample and have them charge me for it, a whole new sampling? Could I just give it to them, and will they take it? The answer is yes, they will, for $19. So that's a way to save a little money. MyHeritage will do it too for $29. And Living Tree DNA will do it, yes, but I couldn't find out exactly how much money they're talking. However, conversely, Family Tree DNA will not be accepted by Ancestry. You can't upload to them, and you can't upload to 23andMe. Health information. Do they provide any health information, which is a big up and coming thing? Ancestry had something called Ancestry Health until January of this year, and they discontinued it. I'm not sure if they're going to go to something new, but they did discontinue it. 23andMe is the big company for that. MyHeritage also does a good job with it. Living DNA, I'm going to show you what they do, but it's not great. Family Tree DNA, yeah, you can do it. They'll do it. It's a separate test, and it'll cost you $900 to do. So you really got to want it in order to get it. What it actually offers to you, I can't tell you. So I can't really tell you whether or not it's worth $900, but that's what they offer. Ethnicity estimates, yep. Everybody does it across the board. Ancestry, I have a thing there that says communities. They actually can tell you, for instance, if you had your ancestors were part of a migration that moved into a specific part of this country, for instance, they might be able to point that out to you based upon your DNA. Again, that can help you figure out when something happened. So autosomal DNA, does everybody do it? Yes, they do. Testing Y-DNA. Ancestry, no, they do not do that as a separate test. 23andMe, yes, they do it. Not only do they do it, it's free. So when you test with them, they test Y-DNA, free. So does Living DNA. Family Tree DNA does in fact test it, but you will have to pay for it separately. MyHeritage doesn't do it at all. Mitochondrial DNA, again, Ancestry's no. 23andMe, Living DNA, yes, and it's free. I'll show you that. Family Tree DNA, yes, but you pay, and no, they don't at MyHeritage. The second thing to the last here that I put in here is about how's the sample taken. Most people are just curious, rather, because one way or the other, they're going to get some saliva out of you. And so spit in the first two companies, and cheek swab, which means it's a Q-tip that you rub on the inside of your cheek, plop into a bottle, and send off. The last one is a cost, and that's what everybody's interested in. Ancestry charges $99. However, they run specials all year long, and they run specials at holidays. So Father's Day, Mother's Day, National I Love My Cat Day, they will run a special, and it'll be $59. The rest of them charge about $79. However, I would tell you, for instance, with 23andMe, if you wanted to have that health component to it, it's going to be more like $119. It is more, depending on what you want to have done. So a centimorgan, what is it and why do I care? Well, a centimorgan is a unit of genetic measurement. This is the definition here. I leave it here. If you go back over this later on YouTube, you can pull it up. And I actually wrote down at the bottom where I got this from. It's not important. What is important is what the thing is. And what it is it shows how much DNA in specific segments that you share with someone else. The more centimorgans you share with someone, the more closely you are related. So before I do that, let me tell you what this means. Each person has about 6,800 centimorgans on their scale, but it actually is only about 34 to 3,800 compared to another person. So if you were to look at your parents or your children, oddly enough, they have virtually the same as what you do. which is strange, but it's how the thing works. Whereas full siblings of yours would only share about 2,200 to 3,400 centimorgans with you. I'm going to show you something about this in a minute, which is going to make it make more sense. What's important is this is how DNA testing companies figure out how you might be related to someone else. So let's look at this. Now we're going to get into the actual companies. This is my results from Ancestry.com. And the first thing to note right at the top is it says self or twin. What happens with some people, oddly enough, and I don't know why they would do it because it costs money, some people actually send in multiple swabs of themselves to kind of check the company to see whether or not they get the same result every time. I don't know why they would do it because you're wasting the money every time you do it, but they do. Conversely, looking at this, they say, well, you either sent us a sample twice or you're an identical twin. And oddly enough, I am an identical twin. So this is my brother. And you'll see that he has 3488 centimorgans shared with me, 100% DNA match. Below is a child, or it could be a parent. In this case, it is a child. But notice the centimorgans, 3462, almost the same as what it was above. Shared DNA, 50%. So even though this is almost the same amount of centimorgans, the test knows that it's only 50% of DNA shared. Two below are grandchildren. What I want you to notice about them is that the DNA is almost halved again, but the first child shares 25% DNA with the donor. The second one, only 20%. And this is what I wanted to point out to you. It is a range. It's not a hard, fast 25%. It is a range. The next picture I'm going to show you is a first cousin. And based on the amount of centimorgans that we share, 11%, they're saying that this one is probably a first cousin. She is. I know her. And she has a public tree. She has a genealogy tree posted. You'll see it has a leaf there and it says common ancestor. Her tree and my tree share a common ancestor. We both know who it is. And so you see this match. And you see matches further on down just like that. So let's take a quick look at these ethnicity estimates that I was telling you about. This is my latest estimate, which means like within the last week. And you see at the top, it says, wow, a whopping 67% Irish. What's more important than that, because as I told you, it's changed. At one point, it was up near the 90s. What's changed is they can actually say whereabouts in Ireland this DNA probably came from. North Kerry, North Cork, the Dingle Peninsula. That's exactly where both my paternal grandparents came from, was Dingle. Go further down, it says Scotland, England, 17 and 10, Sweden and Norway, 4 and 2, Indigenous Americas, less than 1%. I'm going to talk about that briefly a little later here. I want you to remember, these are company-specific estimates based on contributors within their database. That is where this information comes from. Results change based on increases in the number of people in the database. But what about identical twins? Well, wouldn't that be identical? That should be exactly the same, right? No. So here's my identical twins. And you'll see that we're different. Mine's 67, his is 60. It also mentions a couple other places at the bottom of the list for Ireland, North Munster and West Clare that I don't have. His percentage for Scotland and England, different from mine. Only a few percentage points, but they are in fact different. Sweden and Norway, mine says Sweden. His Norway and mine are the same, but mine says Sweden, his doesn't. By the way, I just mentioned in passing to you that whenever you have European DNA, quite often you will have what's called Scandinavian DNA crop up. There's a lot of discussion about what that means, but for Irish people jump onto that and say immediately, oh, it's proof of Viking DNA, where they came down and they were ravaged and raped in Ireland, and that's what we're seeing here so many generations later. Well, I don't know about that, but in any case, very often with any kind of European background, you will have someplace in Sweden and Norway come up. Remember, they were on boats and they traveled. And then this Native American DNA, interestingly enough, there is a tradition in my family that we have Native American. This is, I wouldn't jump up to say proof, but here's something that says, yeah, that's actually a possibility. Below that, I had mentioned to you for Ancestry DNA communities, and here are communities. So for instance, we matched with one that says early Connecticut and New York settlers. They're people that came over from actually Germany and ended up in Connecticut and New York as settlers back in the 1700s. So what does this really mean? Twins are not clones. We're different. Yeah, it's 100% match for genealogy or for DNA, but we are in fact different. Health reporting and DNA testing. As I mentioned to you, Ancestry Health has been discontinued. Living DNA will show you information based on your DNA about nutrition, vitamins, exercise, and food metabolism. They don't go into disorders. MyHeritage and 23andMe do in fact do that. Family Tree has this third party, which is a company called Tovana. And as I said, it's $900. I haven't done that and not likely to do that, but it's out there. So what is it that they're testing for? What do they tell you about? What's important to realize about this is called a genetic predisposition for the following disorders. And we have things like atrial fib, coronary artery disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, celiacs. Does this mean that you're going to at some point contract these diseases if you test positive for this? Absolutely not. That is not what that means. It means that there is a genetic component to this for certain genes that have been found. What turns genes on, what makes these diseases develop because of a gene switch is not understood. It could be environmental, it could be biological, it could be chemical, it could be 1,000 other things. It's all part of research that's going on. The only thing it is saying is this is present or it's not. This has become important lately, specifically because as you see on the list, it says late onset Alzheimer's disease. So again, simply because you see a genetic predisposition to that, that does not mean you're going to contract Alzheimer's disease. It's just something to be aware of. And perhaps it's something to discuss with your personal physician, especially if it has turned up in your family. Moving on to 23andMe. This is my test with them. 98.8% British, Irish. Yeah, that's pretty much going along with the other one when you mix the two of them together. But at the bottom too, it says trace ancestry, 0.4%. So let's look at that real quick. You'll see it says, whoa, Manchurian and Mongolian. Wow, that came out of nowhere. That's not in the other tests. But so I'm not putting a lot of stock in it or understanding it too much. But I am with the Native American. Here is the second test that says 0.2% Native American. That's important because that is a confirmation of something that was found in another test with another company. And this is why, if you find something like this, you may want to test more than once. 23andMe has started offering this, which is really funny. They test for DNA, Neanderthal DNA. I'm not sure what the point of this is, except it's funny and cool and new. Mine is less than 2%, but yes, I have Neanderthal DNA, more than 29% of all other customers. So evidently that's statistically important. So I haven't really read a lot about this. I'm not sure what it's all about, but it's out there now. So it's one of those things that they'll tell you whether you want to know or not. This is living DNA. And I circled here what's important is the fact that they tested, as you see, autosomal, chondrial, and Y DNA. They tested all of them, and it only cost that one price when I started, their basic price. This is what matching looks like. And you'll see it says Great Britain and Ireland, 86%. But if you go all the way down the bottom, it says Europe's another 13.2. But notice too, it says European, South Italy. Now, the other two tests didn't say anything about Italy. But you want to remember that this database is much, much smaller, about 2 million, compared to 23 and 26. The thing about living DNA, if you do in fact have relatives from the UK, what's helpful here is that it breaks it down into counties. And if you see in this particular one, the highest county listed is Devon at 14.6%. That is in fact where my Goodhind relatives came from. We're from Devon, and then they moved to Kent near London before eventually they moved over here. So that kind of shows that it's, in my case, kind of accurate. But more importantly is, if I had no idea where they came from, that might help me where to look. This is what their matches look like. And you see Alan here, Richards, is in fact a cousin, a third cousin of mine. I know of him. I don't know him. He lives in Wales. I know his brother, super nice guy. But this is what these matches look like. Family Tree DNA, this is their primary page. Kind of busy, but I've circled what's important here is I've had 3 tests done. They've all been done individually. You can't just have one test like you do with some of the other ones for all of them. These guys are very into science, and they do a lot of wide DNA testing. In fact, they're the leaders in the field out there. What do their estimates look like? 100% Europe, but if you look at the bottom, Basque and Greek Balkans, another one, no idea what it means or where it came from. But again, their database, about 2 million compared to 23 and 26 million, much smaller pool. What's a match look like? Here's a first cousin that tested with this company. Every single other person listed here are not people that I recognize, not people that I know in any way. Last 2 slides. NPEs, non-parental events. Very traumatic. Most people test their DNA for just a couple of reasons. Usually it's because they want to learn their ethnicity. They could have received it as a gift, and it was probably to learn an ethnicity. Sometimes kids give it to their parents and vice versa. They may do it for a lark. It's usually up to genealogists who want to connect with family. It's a common choice for adoptees. And if you haven't had a chance to see the TLC channel, Long Lost Family, it's really very gripping, very heart-wrenching stories with these people who finally connect to birth parents. But this is how they do it, is with DNA testing. What's important, though, if you're not in that situation, is that some people can find out really shocking things about their family. It is a shocking thing to find out that dad is not dad, or that grandpa is not grandpa. There are all kinds of newspaper stories out there now. You can go onto YouTube and put in non-parental event, and you can find people posting all kinds of things about what's happened to them when they took a DNA test for a lark and then found out something they just didn't want to know. So these unexpected DNA findings are happening enough now where there are actually support groups on Twitter and Facebook for people who have been through such a thing. And that's kind of scary, because that means it's quite a bit. So what I would say to you as a warning, be prepared for the unexpected before you test. So you might think you just want to do it to get into it and find out more about family. You may find out something about family that you just, absolutely didn't know. The last thing I'm going to talk about is privacy. All the testing companies will protect your results. They have to, they're bound to. However, all the tested companies, regardless of what you want, will use your raw data to add to their databases and increase the number of people that they're looking at. They're making their pool bigger. Are they sharing that? No, but they're using it internally. You can set your settings with any of these companies to private so that no one can see your results but you. If you do that, though, you will never see a match. So if you're out there trying to look for a cousin or something, you'll never see it, because once you make your DNA results private, they stay private. It's also possible, if you're swinging the other way, of saying, all right, what if I want to find out about people outside of Ancestry and outside of 23andMe, basically the ocean as the big pool? You can go with a company like GEDmatch, and you can upload that raw data that I was telling about that is about you, how you are you. You can upload this to them. You're still protected under a username and a password. So, but basically the DNA is out there. law enforcement has taken an interest in GEDmatch in the last few years. And you may have read something about it or seen a TV program where they caught somebody called the Golden State Killer in California after literally generations that he was on the loose. The way they did it was there was a DNA test or DNA left at the crime scene. They took it, they made up a person, they sent it out to be tested. When they got the results back, they uploaded them to GEDmatch, and then they looked for matches across the spectrum. Once they found one, they worked it backwards and started looking at genealogy and trying to figure out who this might have come from. And then they finally got DNA from that person and tested that, and they had their man. This has raised an awful lot of ethical questions about how DNA should be handled or could be handled. You know, right now, I think all of us would agree, catch a serial killer? Oh yeah, sign me up. Absolutely, no problem. But that's how it's being used right now. What's going to happen next? Once it's out there, it's out there. So next, are we going to look at maybe migrants? Are they going to start looking at credit card fraud? Who knows? It's a door that you open. GEDmatch right now says when you join them, you opt out, which means law enforcement can't look at it unless you let them. However, in the fall of 2019, they were served with a Florida warrant to make all the information available to them regarding that warrant, whether it was opted in or opted out, and they complied with the warrant. So think about what it is that you want to do. Yeah, you might want to match as many people as you possibly can, but it's really not clear in the long run what's going to happen with this. So, which testing company is the best? Depends on what you're trying to do. For recreational testing, Ancestry, largest database, decent ethnicity estimates, but as I tell you, when the science and the gene pool or the DNA pool changes, they'll change. If you have health questions or those ethnicity estimates, again, a big pool, 23andMe, that's your company. If you're looking for more science information or you want to do specifically why DNA testing, Family Tree DNA is your best bet. If you want to look strictly at the UK, livingdna.com is the way to go. And for Jewish genealogy, myheritage.com is the way. Now, as I mentioned this, I'm sorry again that I can't produce more information for you about MyHeritage, but I just haven't tested with it again. If I do something about this again in the future, I'll test with them, and maybe I can have some more information about that. So I feel like I've run down a hill for the last 40 minutes, and I'm totally out of breath. So if any of you have any questions, could you please submit them in writing to the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and Jonathan will pass them over to me. John, you there?
I am. Thank you so very much, Tim. That was fantastic.
Sure.
As somebody, as a science teacher who is very interested in all this stuff, nicely done. When you said, let's start with the science, I was like, yes, don't apologize, just go with it. It's great stuff. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll pass them on to Tim. I have done both Ancestry and 23andMe, and I find the results very interesting. Nothing terribly unexpected on my end, but it's cool stuff. Tim, what was the biggest surprise that you had with DNA testing?
That's a good question. Interesting story. My grandfather came from a little village called Ballynova on Dingle, and he's a Fitzgerald, which is a lot like Smith over in Ireland. And there were a bunch of them going back in the records well over 100 years. There were all kinds of Fitzgeralds in that same little village. What was interesting about DNA testing was another woman that I ran across, she was testing also, and her family came from the same kind of generation when mine was there, and we didn't match. And it turns out that hers was a completely different Fitzgerald family in this little teeny village of less than literally 50 people, and we don't match. And I found since then, anybody coming from that village is either with her or with me. And what's more interesting than that is the fact that it turns out that neither of our families is actually Fitzgerald. Her family, looking back along that Y DNA line, goes back to the O'Neills. My family goes back to the O'Briens. So somewhere along the line, somebody co-opted the name Fitzgerald, and that's how we became it. But in any case, that's the most surprising thing I ran across.
Cool. That's funny, you know, especially with Irish surnames, you know, it's if in Irish, if you're speaking, you often say your surnames back, or you know, your surnames dictate to whom you're related. You know, there was an interview on Irish radio a couple years ago with this little boy, and his mom's from Montana and his father's from Ranafast in Donegal, and he's a fluent Irish speaker, this 5-year-old boy, and he introduced himself, and it was just like a string of names going back, I don't know, it was like 8 or 9 names. And it's like, well, that's, you know, traditionally how it's done anyway. Folks, please don't be shy with the questions. Pop them into the chat. We'd love to answer any questions you have.
If I have a moment too, if there's nothing that's jumped up, I would tell you another thing that this DNA testing has done. Mitochondrial DNA, which follows that female line all the way back, isn't one that people usually jump to. But I actually ran into a situation recently where it could in fact be important. And that is a relative all the way in the back. I mentioned to you about Native American ancestry. I've traced a person back that it could possibly be this person. It's a female. And at the time in New York State, females who are either African American or Native American and married a white European never had a last name. So she married a Johannes Dijkman, who at his job was he traded with Native Americans. And he was actually called to court several times to talk about their language and everything he knew about them. So the fact that he could have taken a Native American wife is not surprising. So can you do it? I mean, what good is this? Well, with mitochondrial DNA testing, if I can find all of their daughters and then their daughters' daughters through genealogy, and then their daughters' daughters' daughters, all the way down to now, I might be able to find a person whose mitochondrial DNA could be tested. And that person might turn out to have Native American ancestry, pure, following that line. The reason they wouldn't even know about it now if they tested, because they probably did autosomal testing, which would mean their piece was teeny little like mine. But this is one way that you can use another kind of DNA testing in a way that's kind of outside the box.
And as a history nerd, it's just so interesting from that respect, exactly that you were saying there, Tim. Another question is, shouldn't companies be paying people for their DNA data?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it depends. I suppose it depends on how they use it. I mean, you stop and think about it. When you submit a sample, you're entering into a contract. You want a service out of them, and they provide the service. What you do with that service after that point is up to you. As I said, you can keep that stuff quiet. You don't have to tell another soul what you get. But usually people go into that because they want to share it for some reason, or they want to talk about their ethnicity with their children. But yeah, it raises an interesting point. I'm sure the companies would never like to look at it that way.
If we have time, Kathleen would like to know how other people first got interested in DNA, and if there are specific people they're looking for. I'll just toss these two out and you can take them at will there. And the other one is both Ancestry and Living DNA combine Northern Ireland, Scotland. This person has relatives from both places. Do any companies break those down more effectively, or do you find that the DNA is that similar between the two places?
I think what you're going to find is the one that's probably going to give you the most specific information is probably Ancestry, but I don't know how, and this is what raises the point, is that we want them to look at a certain time back, say 500 years, in a certain spot in Ireland. But we can't look at that. All we can do is look at people nowadays who say that they had family living there at that time. And that's really what it's looking at when we pick out these estimates, So it's only as accurate as the information that they're receiving. And what happens when they get more and more and more people adding to the pool, again, they match to a certain geographic location at a certain time, and that's why they're able to give you the estimate that they have. So how accurate it is, the only thing I say is keep getting people out there testing, and it'll get more and more accurate.
Thanks. Tossing that in there, I've done my DNA with, as I say, both 23 and Ancestry, and they both have come back with a substantial, recently especially, a substantial Scottish estimate. And at least according to my family, we don't have any Scottish family members. But again, it's the genetics, it's the movement, and people moved around, you know, especially between Northern Ireland and Scotland. There was a lot of travel, linguistically, culturally, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So it doesn't surprise me that, you know, I was told I have Scottish genetics because that part of the world was very back and forth for so long.
And again, it kind of matters how far back that's looking. They could be talking, you know, 500 years or 600 years or more. So yeah, it wouldn't be surprising that people would lose sight of the fact that family ever came from there.
One other question there for you, Tim. What test would you recommend that is most suitable to find, let's say, a sister and a half-sister?
Any of them will do that for you. The American companies, 23andMe and Ancestry, again, they've got the biggest pool. If you're trying to match, one's 26 and one's 23. If you don't have any luck with one, test with the other, because they don't share that information with each other. You have to go to something like GEDmatch to get the big share. So just because you don't find with the first one, you look for the second. And the thing about it is you may not match with the sister or half sister. You may match with a cousin who knows something, or somebody else that you don't know about. But if they have to test in order for you to see them. It's the only way it's going to happen.
Wildly interesting stuff, I have to admit. Any other questions, folks? Betsy, I see Betsy got one there.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I go qualitative a lot. But in doing my ancestry genealogy, so many times when I get back to my 90-year-old mother, I learn more and more and more. And so many stories that are wild stories about our family members that seem so implausible, like having a relative that was a deserter not once but twice in the Civil War. And from the National Archives, I got when his widow went for the pension, then they had people come and say Jerry Daly and Jeremiah Donahue were this one and the same person. So I've had an excellent experience with that. And I know my siblings have done a lot of DNA stuff. So with our Sicilian, half of the population and connections to Africa, things get even more interesting.
Thanks, Betsy. Any other questions, folks? Here we have, so a couple of things. Since, you know, oh, by the way, just if you don't mind, I will patch into you mentioned the Neanderthal testing is basically, it shows that our species into red. From what I gathered, and if anyone else knows more than me, from what I gathered is that the reason why there are Neanderthal DNA in some Homo sapiens is just through interbreeding in the past, which my high school students are always all of a sudden interested about, like, oh, really?
Breeding. Yeah, breeding.
Or breeding, yeah, or just like different species of humans, you know, sharing the love, so to speak.
No, I think it's breeding.
Yeah. So a question again is, if Homo sapiens all originated in Africa, we'll go with that assumption, how does that fit into this?
It actually shows in, if you do Y-DNA testing or you do mitochondrial DNA testing within the companies, and there's a lot that I didn't show you on the websites. Once you post once they have your results for you, there's an incredible amount of data that they give you. They can actually track what's called a haplogroup with Y-DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing. And they can show you where it originated, literally how it came out of Africa, because everything goes back to Africa, how it came out of Africa and migrated through Europe into the Middle East, or Middle East first, and then into Europe, and then so on, how it spread out from there. based on what your haplogroup is. The RB haplogroup is the one that most often shows up in Europe. But originally, of course, they believe everything came down to that original Adam in Africa, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago.
Cool. Sam asks, do the testing companies retain the actual genetic sample you send them? And could those samples be retested if technology changes?
That's a super question. They do. And I haven't found them ever get rid of it. I had one company that it was 3.5 years from the first test till I had them run the second test. They kept that sample. The only reason they freeze it. The only reason they would not have the sample is if it had degraded, in which case they would submit for you and say, send us another sample, but they wouldn't know that until they went to test. So they do hold on to it for a very long time. How long for each company, I'm sure it's different, but as I say, 3.5 years went by and they ran the test out right away.
And Annie asks, how do you move from DNA testing to questions about genealogy?
So for instance, if you get something where on that list I showed you matches, you get somebody that comes up and that says it's a second cousin. You start getting into how is this a second cousin? You can actually write to that person and start to talk to them. Some people problematically, as I told you, they're not there to connect with people and family. They're just there because they wanted to know their ethnic estimate. And so they're not interested and they never answer you. Others do. I found several people that have filled in some really bizarre gaps in my genealogy chart because they started talking about, or they started in their chart following a line that goes back to a certain person. And I have a person who was around right at that same time, but we match. We match as cousins. So it's not a question of were they were. It's a question of how far back did that go? And if you're at third cousins, it's only a generation or two, one way or the other. So you can match and you can make the next jump to a person that both of you match. So that's how you make the jump between using the DNA and the genealogy. You have to work them both up.
Cool, thanks. I know, as you're saying, Tim, I get updates occasionally as my estimates are updated with the latest technology and science. So, Megan St. Marie here, hello. Megan, or maybe Megan, runs a private publishing company, Modern Memoirs, specializes in personal and family histories. What are the key points regarding privacy and ethics that you'd say we should raise with clients who are considering adding DNA analysis to their genealogy projects?
Very good question. Excellent question. Obviously, I hope that the information that they want to produce for a book, you have to know how you want that book used. So you don't put any information in there that is so, for lack of another word, proprietary. In other words, so specific to you that it can be used in a way that you don't want it used. I've seen books that people have done that, and they were very proud. They had a certificate made up of their DNA, their data. They had it made up as a certificate. They're just so proud of it. Yeah, that's a thing that can be used in a way that you might not imagine it could be used. So you don't want to do things like that. I think it's important for people to realize who the audience is and what might happen with that. I was, one day I was offered a silver cup with an inscription on it, and a person asked me to check into the ancestry of where this cup came from because it was given at a birthday party to someone in 18 something or other, and they were interested to find out about it. And so this person ran a antique store. And so they asked me about it, could I find out about it? And I did. Well, it was very personal. It was given to 7 children. Every one of them got a silver cup and a silver spoon. And this was the silver cup, and it was engraved. And this is 100 years later, and it was in an antique shop. Now, I don't imagine when that person did that, they would ever imagine that the family would lose sight of that cup. But they did. And so it's the idea that book is for your kids. Well, what happens in 100 years or 150 years when there's no more kids? What happens if, God forbid, your line dies out and you can't pass that thing down? So I think one of the things that certainly they should think about for presenting a book, which I think are great. I love those kinds of books. I absolutely love them. It's amazing stories. Oh my God. But how do you want that information passed down? I know that as I'm doing genealogy, there's stories in my family I don't ever want anybody to know that I've run across. I mean, they can find the information on their own if they want by looking in the newspapers I have, but I wouldn't want those stories passed down because it puts people in a bad light.
Very good. Well, thank you all for your very interesting questions and participation. Any last minute ones before we run away?
If by chance you like this, pass us a note too. If there was something I was talking about, you want to know more about, let me know. If you thought I wasted time on something, let me know. Because if we ever do something like this again, I'll want to build on this rather than start over again.
Can I add one thing at the end, Tim? Garamila Mahagut. Really fantastic presentation. Clearly a lot of work went into this, and we appreciate it as always. And I'd like to remind people that the YouTube channel, that where all of these virtual events that we started filming, how you can access it by using the code Amherst Irish Association. So that's how you can refer back to this, because you've received a lot of information today and you may want to refer back to it. And Tim will have them uploaded, I say, by Monday evening. So this event and all of our events this year will be available on our YouTube channel. So final word of thanks to all the committee members who have made this year yet another successful program, to Sam, to Jonathan, Amanda, to Annie, and to Tim, and especially to all of our presenters this year. If you look at our Amherst website, you'll see the range of topics that we've covered this year, from Malcolm's End, starting on race in Irish literature. All that information is on our website, amherstirish.org. Please consider becoming a member if you're not a member right now. Those of you who are members, thank you for your continued support of our efforts. We put our mission on our website. We're trying to do things as a community. Please join us, be part of it. Ar scá a chéile a bhar na daoine. Gur míle maithagah go léir agus slán go fóill.